still coming in, but let's start. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, whether you're watching us live or on PRCA's YouTube channel. It's Measurement Month, and for the next 45 minutes or so, we want to give you some practical insights that you can provide and apply in your workplace. I'm Rich Fernandez, the External and Public Affairs Director of PRCA. I'm thrilled to be joined by a stellar panel today. What they don't know about measurement really isn't worth knowing. So may I introduce to you Johna Burke, who is the Global Managing Director of AMEC, the Association for the Measurement and Evaluation Communication. With it being Measurement Month, AMEC are here, there and everywhere. So thank you, Johna, for sparing the time to be with us today. We have Orla, who's the Insights Consultant of CARMA. I've heard Orla speak a number of times. I always learn loads, so we're in for a treat. Felicia Nugroho is the Analytics and Insight Director of Maverick, Indonesia. She's gone through a long measurement journey with her organisation, and we look forward to learning from her experience. Before we start proper, a couple of housekeeping points for those of you who are with us live. This is being recorded and will go up on our YouTube channel, PRCA TV, in a couple of weeks, so you can share the discussion with colleagues and friends or just listen back. The chat is open, so you can ask questions. We may take them as they come, if that makes sense, or we'll try to get them at the end. So put your question in the chat, and if your question is for a specific panelist, then please make that clear. Well, look, enough from me. Let's get going. So we should start at the beginning, right? Do we have a common idea of value? Value is really important, but what is it? Do we have a common idea? Do clients think the same? I'm going to start with you, Orla.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I think this is a really important thing to get right from the start, is that very often PR and earned comms is coming to the table, talking about the kinds of value it's about driving things like awareness and reputation. So if there is an expectation that you're going to be able to draw a very direct line from a piece of PR activity to a sales figure, for instance, you're going to get yourself into some trouble, because that's frankly just not how people make decisions. The role of PR is to really make sure that we as consumers, as audience, are all aware of an organization, know what it stands for, know what it's about, know what it can do. So shifting value from being something that is financial and linked to that dollar sign, pound sign, whatever it may be, and to something that is actually more aligned to the marketing funnel, I think it's a really, really important first kind of culture shift and mind shift for people when they start to talk about proving the value of PR. You have to really think about what it can deliver and start from there when it comes to trying to actually measure that. And I think that is the issue that people have often run into. They want to come up with something that is comparable in the same sort of way to marketing and advertising, that, you know, we got X amount of clicks or eyeballs and it has resulted in X amount of sales. That's just not the role of PR ultimately.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a major theme of this discussion this morning, isn't it? All those themes that you just picked up. Johna, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think Orla makes a great point. I think the piece that is there that's so important around reputation and crisis comms is no one's attributing any sales to anybody in the middle of a crisis. Yes, that's arguably a huge role of PR. And so that's what makes the AMEC integrated evaluation framework so critical, because when we look at impact of comms, and that really is that value piece. Value isn't the value that we put on things, but it's the value that it has to the organization. And when we look at the impact piece, it's very clearly in the taxonomy, the in whole or in part that contributes to the goal. And so, you know, there are a lot of tactics that deliver against an overarching goal. But I think when you're looking at growth of an organization as a goal that advertising, marketing, and PR all work on together, that's much easier to look at kind of correlation of the work and the value of comms and PR against some of those other metrics, as opposed to delivering similar or comparable exact metrics that we would expect from some of those other more quantitative volume disciplines that we would see.
More to follow up on later on. Felicia, what are your thoughts?
Sorry, I was just muted then. But I think Orla and Johna sum up quite well. When we talk about value, I think, I'm representing this Asia Pacific region. And, recently we just run the first regional summit on measurement. And we did a quick survey pre-summit. And when we talk about what is the success measure? It's 64% is still attributing, like the equivalent ABE or the monetary value to, the measure of success. And I think, there is that sort of still misunderstanding of what, value that comms and PR actually delivers. I think Johna touched on this as well. And, the real value in comms and PR is when the objective is achieved. So, that relates to the organization and, how the communications actually relates to or contributing towards the organizational goal. And, so that refers to outcome and impact, which I think very often, we equate this to marketing and advertising, trying to put in a monetary value to that. So, yeah.
That's really interesting that you're at the stage that you're having your first regional discussions and summits on this matter. What do you think, staying with you, Felicia, what the differences are between different international markets? Because obviously you'll be learning from and contributing to what's going on elsewhere. So yeah, where do you think that different markets align?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, in Asia, I think most particularly, we are still, the region is still counting clicks. So volume is still, a predominant, metric to count. And although now, we had 64% of organizations still using, vanity metrics. And however, I think most recently, we have seen a growing interest. And I think also there is a lot of pressure in the change of media landscape that we just cannot rely on just counting clicks anymore. So I think, yes, we're still in the way, not yet sort of, looking at the real value in terms of looking into outcome and impact. However, I think there's a lot of opportunity to grow. I think the level of understanding of, okay, well, we need to start measuring the real value. So yeah, it is still a little bit, I guess it's slow, but we are, there's still a lot of opportunity, and I think that's really exciting.
What's your take on that, Orla?
Yeah, I think with a very kind of broad brushstroke, there are different levels of maturity when it comes to measurement in different regions. I do think that the UK and Europe does tend to be a little bit further ahead in that journey in terms of looking for more sophisticated metrics, pushing more towards outcomes and impact. But to be fair, there are still a lot of organizations out there, even in this region, that are struggling with figuring out how to prove impact. And we are also seeing, CARMA is obviously a very global organization. We've got quite significant presence in both Asia and the MENA regions. And we're actually seeing some really interesting questions coming up from the clients in those regions about exactly that. How do they really prove their impact? How do they move beyond just outputs and kind of counting stuff? So there is a real appetite, I think, everywhere for it. I think there's also a lot of differences sometimes between different sectors as well. Depending on the sort of nature of the organization, I think there are differences in terms of what they want to look at. More corporate organizations very often are a little bit more in tune with the idea that we mentioned just at the beginning about value and what that means for PR, that it is about reputation, that it is really about speaking to specific audiences with the right message. Whereas sometimes we find it in more consumer-driven organizations. Sometimes there can be a little bit more focus on the kind of the slightly more marketing element of things, getting product mentions out to the right sort of clients and therefore they do start to look at things that are maybe a little bit more quantitative in some ways, and they're not always marrying everything up together. But there is a real variety out there, and I think that what we're seeing from markets like the Middle East, Africa, Asia is a real growing appetite for more impact-based measurement for sure.
And what are you seeing from an AMEC perspective on this, Johna?
It's a great question. And it's important to understand that it's different everywhere. And even when we talk about Asia is, I think, 68 countries. So it isn't even just, 68 markets, it's 68 countries. It's hundreds of languages within that region. And so it means something different throughout the region. I think we continue to see the weight and the impact of hyper-local, even for global brands, that when they are doing their stakeholder mapping, they are identifying in a particular region. It isn't just Asia, but it's, very specifically in Indonesia. And even within Indonesia, I think there's 16 different languages. And so, what does that mean within that region? What is it they're trying to do? And the change in the shift is even when we talk about the peso model, what is earned? Earned is very different in Eastern Europe than it is in the UK, than it is in the US. And so, we've contorted all of these different things to create some streamlined approach that doesn't necessarily answer the call of organizations. And the biggest challenge is that we often see comms teams setting goals but that are very much just around the deliverables that they're looking at for comms. We know that we need to do this many press releases, and here are the campaigns that we're working on, but with no direct link to how those connect to the overarching organizational goals. That's where that deference comes back to those counts and amounts of elements, because oftentimes, and I talk to a lot of CFOs and CEOs, like, hey, you guys are wanting AVEs. Please tell me how you use that, because that's so interesting. And, the answer is usually, after some outside person can come in and ask the why, 4 times, is that they're just frustrated. They're like, oh, we just, art and science and such a delicate balance, and this can't be measured, and this is invisible. And so it's out of frustration that they come back and say, just give us something with a $sign equivalent in front of it. And when my response is, okay, now that they've done that, do you increase their budget by the amount of that value that they've now gained from year to year? Which is always a resounding, are you crazy? Of course we don't. And so, that then further debunks the value of the V in the AVEs, and the equivalency should be offensive to everyone, because there isn't an equivalency to what you're paying for and the work that you're doing to manage those reputational pieces. And we have a very strong stance of, Orla's colleague, Richard Bagnall, the former chair of AMEC, has put 22 reasons why to say no to AVEs. And all of those changes are incredibly valid, especially with the changes in distribution, in cycles. It's an ongoing decline in what some of those numbers are if you're looking just at those volume pieces. But I think the thing that we're doing now is, as opposed to, the public shaming of the AVE, we're trying to meet people where they are and understand better why they are still relying on those elements. And sometimes it comes down to, they're just a small piece of a campaign, and that's an easier way for them to report. They know that it doesn't deliver value against the impact of what the organization is trying to do, but they're just trying to retrofit into some of those elements that are already being delivered by other disciplines. And so that's where that integrated approach is really critical. So people aren't fighting and jockeying for a position of, we had an impact here, you didn't. And, it's only our great salespeople. It has nothing to do with the leads that they were given. I mean, this conversation isn't unique to PR and comms. It runs throughout an organization. And the more disciplines work together, the better they can say, hey, we know that advertising works, we know that marketing works, we know that PR works. But what we all know is that when they are all working with an aligned message and towards a common goal, they all work exponentially better. And I think that's the piece where we can get to that correlation piece, if not causation, around some of those initiatives and campaigns that are not only propped up, but supported and taken over the finish line by comms and PR.
Well, I think I want to focus in a moment just on what all this means in an organization itself. But I was struck by something you just said, John, about at certain points, AVE, one of the problems, and I promised that we weren't going to talk about this, but actually, there is the threat that if you are stuck on that measurement that shall not be named, you are going to see decreasing returns potentially, and that ties in with a question that we've had in the chat, which is, what do we mean when we say earned channels are different in different locations, Eastern Europe, UK, other markets, etc.?
Fair question. And so I will say that in certain parts of Eastern Europe, it's still their free press, as we would define it in kind of the Western world, in the UK and in the US, but articles are only available to people who then pay for those submissions, even though they're considered part of the editorial content. It isn't an official paid, but payment definitely is exchanged in those elements. And that's why it's market to market. Again, I don't know that it's critical or important to call anyone out or to embarrass anyone by it, but I think if you don't understand those local markets, you also don't understand that setting some goals around population, sources, available eyeballs isn't going to mean anything if certain publications won't talk to people from a certain political party or from an industry. That's just the nature of how that works in certain regions. And that then tends to trend for a lot of people in, we're just looking for impressions. So, whether they are paid or earned, we just need those impressions. And for that, I would say that's maybe the most toxic metric, because an impression does not mean anyone was impressed. And that then builds into, then there's no trust, there's no credibility, there's no reliability. And those are those pillars of things that you can manage in the relationship part of relations, of public relations. And if you're just, throwing anything out there to see what's going to work, and you aren't doing it with a very clear strategy towards the impact for an organizational objective, it's very easy to get distracted by big numbers and small numbers. But to try to focus on the story that the numbers tell, as opposed to the story of the organization that's supported by the data and the numbers.
Yeah, I think you're on something. Actually, let's look at the organization level now, because we're talking about markets as a whole, but really, if you're sitting thinking, well, I report into a marketing director, right, and they've got different metrics coming in from each discipline. So how do we actually make sure, we touched on this a bit earlier in the discussion, but how do we really make sure that PR is presented in their best light? And we've had a couple of questions in the chat which pertain to this. So the first one is, what happens when the client says, I don't know, you tell me, set your own objectives, set your own KPIs. That sounds like the ideal position to be in, but it also sounds really terrible, right? Because you're being set up to fail almost. So let's look at that. There's so much to discuss. And then the second question that we've had in on this subject: what do we think of the objectives that can best demonstrate the value of PR for an organization? I think one of the things I'd like to get out of this question also is, what's the right balance between qual and quant? We're talking about a story. We're talking about other people presenting numbers as though they're hard, like whether they mean something. We've come up with ours. What does it mean? We don't know. So yeah, where do we all go with that? That is huge. That is the meat of this discussion, I guess. Orla, you get first go to answer it.
Thanks. Yeah, quite a big set of questions there. There's kind of two two things that I think that we need to do to make sure that we're presenting PR in the best light and that we are making sure that it is aligned to the organizational's objectives. So the first one is to use framework. So something like AMEC's integrated evaluation framework takes you exactly on that journey from setting out what are the organizational objectives, how does that cascade down to comms and what the comms team ought to be doing, tracking that then against your different activities, all of the stuff that you're doing, and then measuring that in terms of the outputs, the outtakes, and the outcomes. So making sure that, first of all, you are clear on what your objectives are. And this is something that sounds kind of, in a theoretical sense, it sounds like a no-brainer, like, well, yes, of course you need to know what your objectives are. The amount of scared rabbit in headlights looks you get when you actually ask a client that makes it clear that it's not always that easy, because very often PR is kind of working in an environment where they're expected to be busy, busy, busy. They're expected to do loads of stuff, but they're not always actually planning. They're not always getting that seat at the table that is alongside marketing and advertising to plan strategic integrated campaigns together. So the first thing is to try and do that. And even if you're not getting that seat at the table, talk to all of those other people, figure out what they're doing, and figure out how you can map against it as much as possible. You have to speak in terms of what the business is trying to achieve. If you're just giving them random numbers and putting a whole bunch of stuff in a dashboard and kind of offering it forward like, oh, please like me, they're never going to actually see PR as anything that is strategic or that is value. You have to explain those numbers in terms of why they matter. And that's where that marketing funnel comes into that as well. So that's something that I often like to try and overlay onto the AMEC framework, so that you're kind of looking at which metrics are speaking to awareness, which metrics are speaking to reputation, which are speaking to kind of the interest in facilitating action and so on as you move through it. And it therefore becomes much easier to draw that line between this one number, this one metric in your dashboard, and what it means to the organization. And making sure that you're speaking the same language as well is really important. So pick up on the terminology, on the literal words that are being used by other disciplines and that are being used by the marketing director. So, whenever we're putting together a framework for a client, we'll often just sort of talk to them about, well, what is the terminology that gets used? What are the sorts of words and the sorts of language that gets used? We'll ask to look at any kinds of strategy documents that they've got so that we can start to weave all of that in. And it just instantly starts to click for someone who is not necessarily in the day-to-day of PR and kind of really understanding everything that you're doing. If you just start using some of the right words, start positioning it in terms of, maybe they're using the word consideration, or they're using the word generating interest, or perception, whatever those terms are, if you start to position metrics in terms of that, you start to get people to understand what those metrics actually mean. So you have to try and think of it in that way, even if there aren't really super, super clear organizational objectives, pillars of everything that we're trying to achieve, and a nice kind of chart that shows how that cascades down. You can do it yourself by just thinking about the marketing funnel, thinking about, okay, who are our target audiences? Who are the people that we need to actually reach? And how are we going to do that? What are the things that we want to say? What do we want people to go away and think about from any of the communications activities that we do, whether that is reputational messaging, whether it is, awareness and understanding of specific products, or it could even be something that's about a specific issue. I've done lots of work with clients who are not necessarily trying to sell a specific product. They're trying to educate on a topic. They're trying to shift public opinion. So it's all about thinking about what is it you're actually trying to get people to do and work your way down the funnel. And when you can map that against the metrics, that's when you start to be able to shift that narrative, that sort of storytelling ability to put things into a much more strategic perspective, and to make sure that the business actually understands why this matters. If you just tell them that, your impressions are X, or your sentiment is at 37% or has gone up, 70% or whatever, how are they meant to understand why that matters? You have to explain it in the terms that they are using as an organization. This means we are being perceived more favorably. This means our customers like us more. You have to try and story tell it, really tell that narrative. And I find it kind of almost the ultimate irony that that's what PR is, right? It's telling stories, it's engaging with people, it's creating that connection. But there is such a fear, I find, of doing that about themselves, of actually telling that story of what they have been achieving and really being able to tie some of those numbers together with that story and do it within the business about themselves. And I think that that's something that, people need to be a bit braver. They need to try and tap into that a little bit more. It's a skill that is inherent and innate to PR pros. They need to try and tap into that a little bit more to be able to tell that story in a better way. Because often when you have the conversation where you really dig into it, the PR pros know exactly why a piece of coverage is good. They know that it's because it contained the right messaging, that it was in the right publication, that it contained all of the sorts of things that will make an impact on the audience, but they're not necessarily able to articulate it in that way. So I think that is a really big part of it. It's about that narrative, that storytelling, and mapping it to what matters to the business.
Just coming back on something there, you've talked about you know, a piece of coverage is obtained. It's the right piece of coverage, the right title, etc. Sometimes I kind of feel that we in our industry can get too excited about that. We went to get, you know, a particular publication is the gold standard. You get that; it's a real career moment for us. And I wonder whether, yeah, we're not that great at kind of zooming out and trying to explain that in those terms. We get a bit starstruck sometimes about what it is that we've done. How can we overcome that tendency, do you think?
Yeah, I think there is a real need to zoom out, as you say, and try and think about, okay, well, what does this actually mean? And sometimes you also need to think of it in terms of, okay, well, this is an initial win. This is an output win. Yes, we got a great output. We got a great piece of coverage. What next? What now? What's the audience going to do as a result? And you have to think about that longer term impact. You know, just because you got that one piece in the Times or whatever it may be, doesn't mean that all of a sudden customers and consumers are flocking to your brand. You have to think about what's next. What's the next step on that audience journey? So positioning it in that terms of the audience journey, I think, and kind of zooming out from that perspective is important. And this is where, you know, there are plenty of experts out there who can help with that. And often having that objective third-party view is what is helpful. You know, that is a lot of what I spend my time doing, is sort of talking to clients and challenging some of the ideas that they have around what good looks like, and being able to help them see it in a slightly bigger picture, in that kind of, you know, zooming out to the 30,000 feet view, and being able to go in both directions, get into the nitty gritty so that they can see how they can shift specific things that they're doing, you know, how they can course correct their strategy, but zoom out and see what is the big picture and what is actually going to help our business from a much more objective and strategic standpoint.
So in really practical terms, we've got this great piece of coverage, and this is what we need to do now, or this is how it fits into what we said that we will provide. Yeah, and just kind of make it really clear for the client. Yeah,
exactly.
Johna. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you know, Orla makes a lot of great points, as always, as I would expect. And I think just to build on that slightly, there is a confidence piece, but I think in a different way, in that I think in the comms team, they're very comfortable talking about what they've done, but without a clear understanding of how the organization makes and spends money, they don't quite know how their piece fits into that puzzle. And that's something where bringing in, and first of all, marketing and advertising people are having very similar conversations to this on a regular basis, right? So we shouldn't feel like it's this anomaly only for comms, but to make sure that, you know, when a report comes out that less than 1% of Google ads are seen by people, I mean, that throws into question a lot of advertising spend. So everyone struggles with this. And that's why the collaboration of all of the disciplines can make the story enhanced, more vibrant, more fulfilled. And that means in looking at even the piece where you're starstruck by something, I would caution everyone to only be starstruck by pieces that are strategically aligned, meaning they hit the stakeholders, the right people at the right time with the right message, that then you can see in a time cycle, whatever is right for your organization. For some people that will be immediate, for some people that will be 6 months from now, but you see correlation to the length of time that it takes your sales team to close efforts, because all of those pieces are coming into play. And now, because of the work of PR and comms, the reputation piece is consistent with someone that someone wants to do business with. And what you're going to see in some of those times is that that sales cycle will be shortened or elongated based on the trust piece of your organization. And, back in the 90s, we used to call this the Oprah effect. Everyone would want to have their product on Oprah because that makes great things. But what isn't talked about is that for every business that skyrocketed to success, thank you, Spanx and Oprah, for bringing this great thing into our life, there were also businesses that were decimated because they simply weren't set up to handle the volume and the feedback. And so people's, as a result, first experience with that organization was terrible because they didn't have the supply chain to manage it. And so something that they really wanted wasn't going to be available for 6 months. So, which is better? Is it better to kind of have that organic growth or to have the Oprah effect create this disparity in what your reputation is and lose sight of the fun and interesting product because you're simply overwhelmed by demand? Because especially now, people don't have a huge tolerance. It's like, okay, I'm not going to wait 4 months for anything. I don't care how great it is. I mean, even people who are waiting for Teslas are now like, yeah, that's just too long to wait. I'm going to do something else. So it's understanding that buyer behavior. And that's where comms is doing an excellent job in customer journey mapping and really identifying how stakeholder behavior is changing and how they're adjusting their messages, their supply chain availability, their approach to ESG. All of those things align with making sure that they are consistent with what the behavior is that their stakeholders expect from them.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point of being really au fait with your business model. As you say, if you spike a load of demand and you can't meet it, then you've actually destroyed value rather than created it. Spot on. Felicia.
Yes. Just building on to what Orla and Johna have said. I think we should admit it that we all get struck by high numbers. And I think this is something that I think as an industry that we've been, our performance has been basically valued by high numbers. So, and I guess just to summarize from both of Johna's and Orla's point, the difference, I think the key difference between the marketing and comms is, the difference between the short-term results, which is basically what we get through performance marketing, like the clicks, the engagement, the likes, and all of those numbers, to the long-term objective that comms is trying to achieve. And I think this is where the differences lie. I think when we talk about results, when we talk about the number of clicks, the number of views, news articles, the clips, AVEs, and all of that, it does gives an instant satisfaction. And I think, it is a feel-good feeling, right? So using the framework and being able to pull ourselves back and trying to link it and trying to understand the bigger picture, what is the organization is trying to achieve? I'm trying to connect the comms with, the end goal, which is basically you're not going to achieve that over a short period of time, and certainly not instantly. So I think this is something that also for us, here in this part of the market, we're trying to educate our clients as well, trying to separate between, okay, you still can look at the number of clips, you still can, count the number of engagement, but at the same time, we shouldn't lose a bigger picture. We should continue to bring ourselves back to, okay, what is, the organization is trying to achieve and how comms can actually contribute towards achieving that.
It's like we've gamified certain types of data and not others. And maybe our task is, because we all love to gamify, right? That we should try and work out how we're able to do that. Right, okay, it's time to talk about data. We've got this far without, but we've really got to get in the numbers. So where do we start, really? Lots and lots of different questions. I'm going to fire loads and loads, and let's see what we can pick up. So how do we know what data we need? How do we work with the data we have? How do we make sure, just going back to some of the threads that we've talked about, that the clients understand what data we need, and if they've got really good data sources, they're kind of, it's not just stuck on a server somewhere, they're kind of opening it up to us. So how do we then build the credibility from that? And how do we just make sure that we're using that data and kind of building on it? So there's a lot in here to unpack, but we really need to do it, don't we? Johna, let's start with you.
So I think this is the ultimate test of trust, right? When you are talking to a client, what and how much data they are willing to share with you so that you can identify that correlation and ultimately causation of the efforts of your work. And that is going to be different for every organization, for every objective of what people are trying to accomplish. And I think Felicia made a really important point, and agencies especially, I think, have a challenge, and internal comms teams, is that very few elements are instantaneous, right? You might see a spike in activity, in views, in something, but to get to that outcome or impact piece, you're looking at the long tail effect of that. And that's where organizations need to have that factored in to their objective. So when they say, you know, okay, we've now crafted this beautifully worded, measurable objective, smart, measurable objective, you know, then what's the life cycle of this? When will this hit your bottom line for your organization in a successful engagement? And they need to have that answer, because if you have a 2-month engagement, you know, because you're working on a particular campaign, we'll talk about this from an agency perspective, and not to speak for Felicia, but it makes a very good point. You know, your engagement is for 2 months. Well, if at the onset they say that they know that they won't see the outcome or the impact of these things for 12 to 18 months, you reporting on anything other than some of those vanity metrics during the tenure of your engagement is useless. You've all agreed to that. So what can you talk to around, okay, here's our engagement, but what we're going to do is we're going to set up these interviews with these important stakeholders on a quarterly basis in these other iterations, so that we see that you're also nurturing everything that we were able to drive and build for this campaign. So let's see if you're expecting this to be a 12 to 18 month cycle, if through that nurturing, we can't reduce that down to a 6 to 12 month cycle, because that's real money. Saving time and bandwidth of all of those other people, of your salespeople, of contract reviews, of legal reviews, that's real money to the bottom line that doesn't care how many media impressions you have or if you have advertised. It only cares about the cost per head and the fully weighted cost per employee of an organization. And that's one of those pieces to kind of touch on the question that's in the Q&A, because it does tie into this. You know, I get a little cringy when people are like, oh, we have an ROI report. I'm like, do you? I can't. Oh, I'd like to see it, please. Because those ROI reports, I mean, it might have a header of an ROI report, but if you haven't clearly stated what the investment is in the first place, and that means even for a comms team, if you aren't looking at the fully weighted cost of your employees, including their health benefits, their vacation time, all of these other pieces, then you're not talking about ROI the same way that your CFO and your CEO are talking about it. You're talking about what is the return that you believe you are attributing based on a cost that you are incurring. And that is the language of communications, not in the language of business. And that's where we need to not just be good storytellers, but speak it in the language that's relevant to the internal stakeholders. And that's where, if you know that if you report to the CMO, that the CMO is delivering, you know, that you're delivering a 50-page deck of all of your value metrics, but that each month only 5 slides go to your board, you need to know how you get on those 5 slides. What are you doing that's demonstrating that? Because it isn't the churn. It isn't the how many and how much have you done it, but it's the why. And the why you continue to test. And that's where PR can learn from advertising and marketing is to have the confidence in testing messages, understanding where that scale is on trust and how you're seeing some of those conversions. But what data is available also is based on your trust. And if people don't believe that you have someone on your team who's credible to then make that data actionable, why would they go to the effort of gathering it all for you? So it comes that complexity of the talent that you have on the team and how credible comms are in telling the data story.
I guess one of the things that's interesting there is, you're talking about the 50 slide deck that goes into a 5 slide deck. Sometimes you don't know whether it's the marketing director who's doing that filtering or whether it's driven by questions that they're being asked at board level. And so one of the things that you might do is suggest over a period of time that you try different things and see what comes back and see what, it's an iterative process. You're talking about the language, you're talking about building up relationships and working out what has currency and what doesn't. Think
we're talking about collaboration. And if you don't know the basis of those 5 slides, someone does. Buy that person a coffee. I mean, because if you aren't understanding why you're doing it, then even your testing is fruitless. I think that there should be a benchmark. There should be a benchmark that everyone agrees to, and those things are going to be consistent. But that when you're also identifying insights, early indicators, other KPIs that are manifesting through some of those efforts, then you have the forum to raise those if you have the credibility. But it does come down to credibility and trust. And if you can't even find out who's dictating what those slides are, that's a much bigger problem than what your data looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Felicia.
Yes, I think when we talk about data, what data we should have and what data we can get, we're still seeing a huge gap in that. I think from where we are from the agency perspective, very often the data that we need, we are not able to get that due to, say, for example, if we talk about if the objective is trying to shape a certain reputations or to improve our reputations, then obviously we do need to have a baseline. We do need to know what is the current reputations, what are people thinking about the company, etc. So, and that comes to conducting a survey, and this is the area where I think we find that in PR, the company are not allocating enough budget to conduct survey, and that budget is normally given to marketing, which is they conduct more frequent type of market research. So we're still seeing that gap. However, I think this is where we work in my team. I mean, I continuously trying to encourage everyone to trying to be creative and trying to see, okay, let's work with the data that we have and what can we dig further from that. So instead of just looking at the quantity, we start to look at qualitatively, trying to dig into the narrative and trying to see how that narrative is actually shaped over time, and trying to link that to the other data that we have. So I mean, there are ways. I mean, yes, there are some limitations. However, I think we can, we're continuously trying to convince and gain that trust from our clients. There are ways for us to continue working on that, looking just beyond, the data that we have.
No, you're quite right. Orla.
Yeah, just picking up on that point from Felicia, I think it's often about making the case for why they need more budget. So you set out, okay, this is what we've got. This is the bits where it's proving the different things we want to prove. But here are the gaps. If, for instance, we can't demonstrate definitively what your reputation looks like, because that means asking people what they think. If you're not going to pay to ask people what they think, you're not going to know. So, I think there is a lot of honesty that there needs to be about just being quite clear of, yeah, we'll put together the best that we can, but if you're not going to give us the budget for it, then you're not going to get the best information that you can help to make you make better decisions. When it comes to figuring out how to know which data you need, that is frameworks. That's where you need to start with the framework. You need to think about the audience journey and figure out what might be available. We often kind of start with like an ideal world scenario. Okay, so let's forget about budget, think about all of the data points that might be available to help demonstrate these particular things. And then we start figuring out what's available within the organization, what's maybe available freely. You know, there are lots of kind of quite public pieces of information around, for instance, brand tracking or opinion polling and stuff that you might be able to tap into. And also just make those relationships around the business where you need to. As Johna says, you know, figure out who's got the data, figure out who's got the ear of somebody, and work that relationship. Figure out how you can get your hands on the data, figure out what way do you need to make the argument to be able to get the budget to get the data that you need. And don't think of it as just being something that is going to be, you know, easily purchased. There will be so much data within an organization that is not being utilized, or it's sitting in silos. And often explaining to that other team, explaining to, for instance, for the web team, I want to have a look at your data, not because I'm trying to mark your homework, not because I'm trying to talk about what you have done, because I think it's such great data, it can help me prove what I am doing. And that is something that is not always easy to do, but it takes time and it takes persistence, I think, to really start to try and educate people on why you might want the data as well, because there is often a sense of, oh no, but you won't understand it. And no, but this makes me very nervous because I think that you're going to start to, you know, look at what I've been doing and saying that I'm doing things wrong. You need to make sure that they understand that you wanted to help to demonstrate what you are doing, not to mark their homework, not to tell tales on what they're maybe not doing so well, but because there are lots of overlaps in these sorts of things, because audience journeys can be a bit messy at times. You know, you can see lots of kind of tangents go off because none of us make decisions in a truly linear or vacuum kind of state. So as much data as you can get and mapping it across that audience journey and figuring out where the gaps are to go back and argue for that budget. And often when you start to show some data that is demonstrating impact, or is at least starting to knock on that door, you get the lean in. You get the people kind of saying, oh, okay, this is interesting. Now I can sort of see what's going on here. Well, what about this or what about that? And you sort of say, well, we don't have the budget for that. And that is how those conversations happen. You tease people essentially with the right kinds of data, the interesting kinds, and then you get that increased budget for more in the future.
Sounds like we're talking about a cultural shift in our organizations and getting people to stop thinking in data silos and more widely. Felicia, I want to come to you because you've gone on a journey in your agency over the last 5 years where you've done that cultural shift. Somebody asked, do you have an example of brands or agencies that are doing this well? Well, you're kind of their standard bearer right now, but we'll come to the other two to ask that question after this. How did you do it? How do you know that you're winning?
Okay, interesting. Well, obviously, you know, we started from very, you know, I guess, beginning, because we came from obviously ABEs driven. I mean, all of clients use ABEs, and I mean, that was pretty much the only measure of success. I think, you know, we started to feel that, okay, well, this is no longer relevant. I mean, we would be doing, you know, some great jobs for our clients, meaningful work. At the end of the day, we were only able to prove it just by the number of clicks, and even worse through ABEs. So then we, you know, when we discovered AMEC, I think that really, you know, changed our life. And yeah, so we started using the framework, the integrated evaluation framework. We changed our culture. We realized that we had to start from within. So, you know, we did a complete shift internally because we wanted everybody to be on the same page. All of the consultants, the analysts, everyone need to have the same understanding of why we're doing this, why it's important to start, you know, measuring outcome and then trying to link that into impact. So we did a lot of internal educations, you know, attended AMEC courses, etc. So in parallel, what we did then, we started to also creating that awareness among our clients. And obviously that wasn't an easy or, you know, smooth sailing, right? Because everybody was still using, you know, ABE. So we didn't stop that because, I mean, it was impossible. We knew that we couldn't just sort of take out the ABE immediately. We continue providing that, but at the same time, we also trying to provide different, measure. We started to introduce them into, a different way and looking at output, even though it was still, output driven. We started to introduce them into more qualitative, looking into the narrative, looking into not just share of voice, but more targeted share of voice. We're trying to link that into, instead of looking at, just all media, we started to say, okay, so what they're trying to do in terms of their product segments, say if it's among the lifestyle. So we focus on that particular media. So we started to introduce something that is new. And the first step was really the objective was trying to reduce the dependency on AV. At the same time, we continued to build on, started to introduce outtakes, and we just continue on. So slowly, gradually, clients started to become more curious. Okay, well, that looks interesting. I think Orla shares similar experience here. That looks interesting. Okay, show us more. And how did you get that number? Oh, can you actually get that? So then continue to build up. So eventually we managed to transition, all of our clients, to move away from ABE, using ABE totally. At the same time, I think internally as well, we tried to, we started to be more confident and, started using the integrated evaluation framework as a whole. So, I mean, it was a gradual process. It was a step-by-step. And I think, very often, started very, instead of making a big leap, we've seen sort of like gradual sort of milestones. So yeah, that's pretty much the journey that we have experienced at Maverick. So
that's fabulous. And I should say that for those of you who are watching on YouTube, we'll put a link to the framework in the show notes so that you can go and have a look for yourselves. Although, frankly, you should be using it already, so shame on you. But do click on the link. Orla or John, do you have anything to add from clients or others that you've worked with or observed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very similar. It's about not necessarily expecting people to make a sweeping change throughout everything they've been doing and start completely fresh, because the reality is that's just not going to happen. They have so many stakeholders they have to report to. People will be quite hesitant to move away from certain metrics. It's about that sort of testing and teasing. So starting to show them some metrics alongside, doing things in parallel so that they start to get a sense of how it works. And we often say, start small, start simply, but just start. And I think that is the most important thing when it comes to making that cultural shift. Pick just one or two things, whether it's a campaign that it's got very specific objectives around that you can measure it in a more holistic way, whether it is then starting to fold in just one particular type of data, maybe something like web traffic that is easy to get your hands on. Just start with a little bit and let it build steam. Because this is something that we still see, we talked earlier about the kind of sophistication level being a bit different, the maturity in different markets. I still see this all the time from clients where they've got vanity metrics or they're just using outputs and they know that they want to go beyond that, but they also know that they've got someone quite senior who is not going to let them let go of it. Not unless they see evidence that there is something that can work better. So we have to be realistic that we're not going to just chuck everything out and start fresh. We have to do things in parallel and we have to do things iteratively.
You're absolutely right. And yeah, bring that senior person along with you for the ride.
Mm-hmm.
Johna?
Yeah, I'll just add that it also, while it's a simple process, it's not easy. And it requires education and upskilling of a lot of teams. I mean, Felicia did, but Felicia was the very first person in Indonesia to complete the AMEC certificate on measurement and evaluation. So, I mean, that then created that project that she has to go forward to then see how that works operationally. So taking the theory into practice. And, the resources like the AMEC integrated evaluation framework and the measurement maturity mapper, so people can even decide where they need to put their pin in the map as they're on the journey. those are only possible because of our members making those resources available, and then people taking it from that point to then know, okay, we will be better when we upskill in this way. And, gone are the days of someone who is a really effective communicator being like, I'm in comms because I'm not good at math. Data isn't about math. Data is about being able to ask the questions. Well, what does this mean? Why is this important? Of the data that they're being given, to be able to then uncover some of those insights from that. And that doesn't require them to be able to know statistics. It requires them to be able to have someone on staff to diversify their team so that they have someone who can bring that to light and give them the answers that they need. So just as comms needs to be better storytellers, they need to not trying to be what they aren't as well.
I think that a lot of people on this will be feeling a huge sigh of relief at kind of feeling that burden of thinking they need to be numerate. You still do kind of need a little bit, right? But I think that's grand. Now, thanks to some terrible chairing, we've still got 2 questions to go. So, and we've only got 3 minutes, so I'm going to ask for really quick answers. There are 2 questions that kind of link together that we've had in the chat about organizations that take a slightly more qualitative view, maybe. So those that are professional services. We have a quite long question here from a public affairs agency. I'll read it very quickly. We have a client that's being asked to demonstrate to their senior board the value that building good relationships with political stakeholders can have for business. We can demonstrate examples of how a good relationship with X or Y or Z politician has led to dealing satisfactorily with a customer complaint or unblocks an issue at local authority level. Any thoughts on how we might demonstrate value?
I'll jump in there. I think it is about the storytelling a little bit. It's about the narrative. So they've mentioned that, they've being able to have successful dealings with an issue or unblocked a particular issue. Position that in terms of why that's important for the organization. That's important because it gives you a license to operate. It's important because it allows you to exist. So when you're able to put it in those kinds of terms, there will be some things that are qualitative where you can't put an actual number against it, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't still bring that into the reporting that you do. It's about explaining it in that very clear strategic way.
And I'll just add, I think that in an environment like that, I've seen some interesting reports that were driven around an allies report. And then when something like a crisis strikes, they're able to then leverage and see how those allies really came to work for them, because you cannot communicate your way out of a crisis that you've acted yourself into. And that means fostering and facilitating good allies along the way, whether they're politicians or some other key stakeholder, keeping them very clear and having those specific touch points is an important kind of qualitative approach, so that when you do need them, hopefully never, but when you do need them, that they do have trust and they are there for you to speak up on your behalf because you have fostered that.
Cool, thank you. And a final question to each of you. It's measurement month, right? So it's going to be measurement month this time next year. What do we hope will have changed in 12 months? What should people take back to their organization and try and change in the next 12 months?
I'll start first. Storytelling for me. Position your metrics in terms of why they matter to the business. And if you can't articulate why they matter, then they probably don't.
Fabulous, thank you. Johna?
For me, it's an appetite for data. It's understanding where and how it can facilitate improvement in both your operations and in your communications. And it isn't only going to be through generative AI. So, let's not put all of our eggs into that basket, but to make it so you have a very agile and innovative team that's always looking for new ways to test and to cycle through and to be finding insights and early indicators for your organization by using data.
Brilliant. And last word goes to you, Felicia.
Okay, well, I'm coming here from the perspective of anyone out there who is trying to start in the measurement journey. And I guess, my message is just start. You just have to start. And there is no better way, better time to actually start, because technology will continue to, to dominate. The media landscape will continue to change. So I think we just have to get started so we can start in, proving values and, of what we do in PR and comms.
Fabulous. So, wow, that has been a really, really great discussion. On behalf of the audience listening, I'll just say a huge thank you to the three of you for being so open with your insights this morning. We'll revisit this topic, of course, next year, so we'll see what has changed and whether we've moved on. Thank you to those of you who typed in your questions. We answered almost all of them, but there are a couple coming in right now. We'll have to answer in some other way, but we won't forget them. So, Felicia, Johna, Orla, thank you so much. Thank you to you who have tuned in, whether live or on YouTube. Enjoy the rest of the day, but from PRCA to Rafa now.